And we're very dog friendly until we have farms there, so you bring your dog.
No dogs.
No dogs?
No dogs.
Oh, apparently no dogs. I bring my dog.
That's different.
I'm still learning the
But
rules.
you still have the state management rules and regulations
Yeah.
on whether it's a management area, then if you bring a dog, it has to be on such and such a size leash.
And my dog's a working dog. Yeah. So if everybody has the info, maybe we should put the map back up. Does that make sense? Thank you. I'm Matt Tracy, and as you were informed, I was brought into this project to be kind of a hands-on interim manager who wouldn't really be living there. I didn't intend to farm there. I just wanted to help take this big empty property and make it something that we could move some farmers onto. So as Paul said, right now, the new managers are moving in, but things are still very much in a state of kind of blank slate. Nothing's being grown in any of these fields. When we got there were weeds that were this high, and we had to work with the state and another farmer to get all those weeds mowed down. So now, blank slate. Springtime, the weeds are this high, and we'll see where we get with that. But my background is in small-scale farming. I started with my partner, Catherine, about 10 years ago doing this stuff, and we began as a farm that's pretty typical for this day and age in Rhode Island. People that wanted to grow vegetables because we had a market for vegetables, but we had very little access to land. So we had a business model, and we knew we could make it work, but we just needed to get onto some land. So what we ended up doing was doing intensive growing in Providence, urban farming as they call it, and we supplemented that with rural farming. We had land in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, a bigger piece of land, where our goal was when we started, we'll grow the big stuff out there, and we'll grow all the little herbs and fresh stuff in Providence. That way we'll be able to meet our market demand, and we'll be right in our market. All these restaurants in Providence were buying produce, and we couldn't grow enough of it. So that's what we were doing for a few years, but it was really tiring. We were like commuters. We were living in Providence and driving out to Rehoboth and trying to make it work out there on land that was real stony. It was probably better suited to pasture than what we were doing, but it was what we could find. But we were always looking for the next thing. We were always trying to figure out what would work better. And as our urban farming was kind of growing just fine, but we were cramped because we were doing it during the time in Providence when the real estate market was crazy. So people were buying up lots, and same thing in the rural areas. At the same time that interest in local agriculture was coming back in the state, it was the same time that real estate was going insane. So all these properties were being bought, and farmland was becoming more and more expensive. So our little search to find a nice piece of farmland was almost crazy. People were like, you're not going to find anything. And they were right. It was just unaffordable. So we stayed where we were. We kept our house in Providence, and we found a farm in Johnston that, like Snake Den, is a historic property. It's extremely old. It's I think the family that owns it has been there for nearly 400 years in some capacity. The buildings that are there now are, one of them's 100 years old, another one's 250 years old. It's a beautiful, typical, historic Rhode Island farm called the Mathewson Farm. We started leasing that in '07. And that really changed what we were doing. It really made it so that we could set up a farm basically in one place. We still couldn't live there, but we had a piece of farmland that wasn't threatened by development because of a state program where development rights are bought by the state. That's run by DEM, the same agency that owns this farm. Unlike this farm is owned outright by the state. Our property the state just came in and said, we're going to give you the fair market value of this property, but you get to keep it. That's what they said to the owners. We're going to pay you to not build on this property, to leave it in farmland. So all the owner had to do was sign some documents that said, in perpetuity, this will be an agricultural property. This will be a farm.
So instead of paying taxes on land that would be valued much higher for housing development, they give you the development rights to keep it open space.
Well, no, we give them the development rights.
You give them the development
Yeah.
rights, right?
We give, yeah.
They make sure that it stays as productive land.
Yeah, the state is basically making a deal, and they're doing this as much as they possibly can with landowners around the state. Instead of buying land through eminent domain like happened here, they're just saying, you keep the land, you can live here, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't develop this property. And I think you do, and then the other stipulation is keep it in active agricultural use. If you do that, we're going to give you another deal. We're going to say your taxes are lower. That's called the Farm, Forest, and Open Space Act. That's really important for preserving farmland, just as the development rights being sold are important for farmland. So both of those things were in our favor when we were looking at this property. It wasn't going to get built on, even though the town had thought it was. They zoned it residential so that technically we're not even allowed to farm there under the codes of the town. But we didn't really pay attention to those because we knew the farm had been a farm for 300 years. There's something called the Federal Right to Farm Act, and that says you can farm basically if you're farming, you can farm, and nobody can tell you not to, is really what it comes down to. If your neighbor doesn't like your manure, well, you have a right to have that manure there. It might not be a good idea, but you have a right to that. So
And that state and federal legislation supersedes the local.
yes, and we actually had to invoke that at one point because we took this abandoned piece of property, this 5-acre field with a 10-acre woodlot, and these unbelievable historic buildings that are almost identical to what you see at Dame Farm. Same year, same architect. It's interesting. It's part of why I got involved with Dame Farm, because our farm has so many historical similarities that I could kind of just transfer what I learned at our place to the Dame Farm. But Dame Farm is just much bigger. Anyway, so we're occupying this land, and we're trying to farm it in the way that we learned how to farm. In the 21st century, what we learned was sustainable agriculture. We learned that you could use intensive methods. You could produce your own compost and other soil amendments to build your soil health. You could then produce higher yields of vegetables on smaller acreages. And that model, from my perspective, is a really great model for Rhode Island because we have such a dwindling supply of land and we have such a demanding market. There's a really strong market for fresh produce. You can almost never grow enough of it. And the closer it is to an urban center, the lower your costs are of getting it to your buyers. So in our case, we sell direct to buyers in Providence. We don't sell our stuff wholesale to a middleman. We get almost full price for what we grow. And that's what makes small farms viable in Rhode Island, if you can do that. And farmers do it in different ways. You can form a co-op. You can get together with other growers. That's what we did. We formed the Little City Growers Co-op. And that was a way for us to share the cost of, once you have your produce washed and you have it in a bag, you've got to get it to that restaurant or that school or whoever's buying it. You get together with other growers and you share that cost. You put it all in one truck and you drive it into town, and suddenly everybody's, we don't all have to drive into town, once a week. One person does it. Things like that, sharing resources really helps to make your farm viable. Back to the Right to Farm Act. So we're on the property and we're making big changes. It's stuff that the neighborhood hadn't seen before. This is an old place that had been basically a hayfield and then just acres of invasive Asian bittersweet, poison ivy, ailanthus trees, those invasive Chinese trees, just sort of taking over the property. They were growing all over the barn, and the field edges were all a mess. So we came in and we started clearing that, and we were planting native species, and we were putting up high tunnels, and we were...
Does everybody know what a high tunnel is? Anybody not know what a high tunnel is? Good.
High tunnels are great. They're really, they're old technology. People have been putting steel hoops and bending them in the shape of, a Quonset hut for decades. But in recent years, they've become really popular as a way for growers to produce vegetables year-round. A high tunnel is different from a greenhouse. They're the same structure, basically, a hoop-shaped structure with plastic on it. But the difference is that greenhouses are heated. You have, lots of controls. You're keeping the environment at certain temperatures and certain humidity levels. High tunnels are more simple, unheated structure usually. You can heat it, but it's not like the main purpose of it. The main purpose of it is just to create a microenvironment where it stays a little warmer in the winter, so you can grow things year-round that can stand. You're not going to grow tomatoes in them, but you grow other crops. You're just protecting your crops a little bit more. Anyway, we were putting those up. We were putting in irrigation lines because vegetable growing is different than hay or silage or what else? Cash crops that you might grow. It's got a higher return, but you also have higher inputs. Vegetable crops eat up a lot of water. They eat up a lot of nutrients in the soil. So you have to do more. It's a more intensive form of agriculture than like I said, a hay field. A hay field, you can kind of just maintain it in a very minimal way, and you can get a nice crop of grass and mow it and maybe manure it or fertilize it on a yearly basis. But this is more, you're working the land all the time. You're plowing, you're cultivating, you're mulching, there's just so many different activities involved, but your return is quite a bit better. So that's why you see so many farmers trying to take on vegetable growing. And that's why you see hay fields hay fields are almost more threatened than vegetable fields right now, because it used to be that when local farming wasn't as popular, there was just these empty fields, and farmers would come and hay them once a year, twice a year, bale the hay and feed it to their horses. Now we're actually importing lots of hay from Canada and Maine and upstate New York because more people here want local produce. So it's kind of a give and take. There's only so much land, so you've got to make decisions about what you do with it. But anyway, some people in the neighborhood loved what we were doing. Other people saw it as kind of like, what is going on over there? Do they make any money? It's crazy. They work all the time. They're putting up all these structures. We liked it when it was just empty. But the problem with it being empty was the property was collapsing. The barn was falling down. There was no money to repair it because nobody was using the land. The only way they could have saved the barn that's there, this 100-foot-long historic dairy barn, would have been to sell a bunch of land and then pay for repairs, or to rent the land to us and use the money to maintain the property, which is what our landlords decided to do. And they're saving money on their taxes by doing that. So it's a kind of active use makes it so that the farm can survive. And we see that here. What I did as farm manager, part of what I did was to create a budget for this place. Like, what does it take for my organization, NRICD, to just own it and do nothing? What does it take for NRICD to own it and rent out the house? What does it take for NRICD to rent out the house and then get some farmers to rent the fields? Or maybe just one farmer? Different farmers pay different rents depending on what they're growing. We have a pretty low rent for hay. We're